On April 7, 2026, Pakistan's Prime Minister stood in front of the cameras and announced something the world had been waiting to hear for more than 5 weeks. Iran and the United States had agreed to an immediate ceasefire, all fronts, all hostilities, Lebanon included, effective immediately. The Prime Minister called it a triumph of diplomacy. Iran's foreign minister confirmed it. Trump posted on Truth Social calling it a workable deal. Oil prices dropped 15% in a single trading session. Shipping companies began monitoring the Strait of Hormuz. Financial markets surged. And in Tehran, Iran's government did something it almost never does. It declared victory. Iran said it had forced the United States to accept its 10-point framework. Iran said it had won. Iran said the deal included lifting all American sanctions, withdrawing U.S. forces from bases across the region, paying war reparations, and agreeing to a new mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said that after 6 weeks of war, after losing its supreme leader, after watching its nuclear facilities get bombed, after absorbing strikes that killed more than 3,500 of its citizens, Iran had not surrendered. It had negotiated, and it had gotten what it needed. Tehran was wrong. Not because the ceasefire was not real, it was real for a few days, but because Iran and America had not agreed on the same deal. They had agreed on the same words. The meanings were entirely different. And when those different meanings collided, in a hotel in Islamabad 4 days later, in a Truth Social post that called Iran's leadership lunatics, in missiles fired at American warships in the Strait while the ceasefire was technically still in force, the gap between what Iran thought it had and what Trump actually intended became the most consequential misunderstanding in modern diplomatic history. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the specific pressure that existed on both sides in the first week of April. The United States was spending $1.8 billion per day on the war. Gas prices had crossed $4.30 per gallon and were still climbing. Spirit Airlines had gone bankrupt. The Federal Reserve was watching inflation data it had no normal tools to address. American consumers were angry. Trump's domestic approval on the economy, historically his strongest issue, was deteriorating in real time as gas prices remained elevated and supply chain disruptions spread into grocery stores. Trump needed a deal that he could hold up as a victory. He needed something that would bring oil prices down. He needed the Strait of Hormuz to open. Iran needed something different. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, had taken power in the worst possible circumstances. His predecessor killed by American and Israeli strikes, his country's military infrastructure destroyed, its nuclear program set back by years, its economy already weakened by decades of sanctions and now further battered by war damage. The new leadership needed, above all else, to demonstrate to its own population and to the broader Muslim world that Iran had not been defeated, that it had survived a combined American-Israeli assault, that it was still standing, still fighting, still capable of demanding respect. A deal that looked like surrender, particularly a deal that required Iran to give up its nuclear program immediately before getting any economic relief, was politically impossible for Khamenei's new government. It would have been seen domestically as confirming that America had won. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif understood both of these pressures. He had been working the phones for weeks, shuttling between Washington and Tehran through diplomatic channels, trying to find a formula that would let both sides claim something. And on April 7th, he found one, or thought he had. The ceasefire announcement was built on ambiguity. Iran read it as America accepting its 10-point framework, which included massive economic concessions before any nuclear talks. America read it as a temporary pause that would lead to serious negotiations on all issues, including the nuclear program. Both governments confirmed the same announcement. Both governments walked away believing they had gotten what they needed. And the gap between those two readings was wide enough to swallow whatever peace might have been possible. The first sign of the gap came almost immediately. Iran's state media published detailed accounts of what Iran said it had agreed to, accounts that emphasized the lifting of sanctions, the withdrawal of American forces, and the recognition of Iranian sovereignty in the Strait. American officials pushed back. The State Department said the ceasefire was a starting point for negotiations on all issues, including the nuclear program. Iran's parliament called the American position an attempt to reinterpret what had been agreed. The argument about what the ceasefire meant had started before the ceasefire had even been fully implemented. Then came Islamabad. 4 days after the ceasefire announcement, J.D. Vance flew to Pakistan with Trump's two most trusted envoys, Steve Witkoff, who had negotiated the Gaza ceasefire and the hostage releases, and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, whose back-channel relationships in the Middle East had been a feature of the first Trump term. The Iranian delegation was equally senior. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. This was not a working-level meeting. These were the decision-makers, or the people closest to the decision-makers on both sides. If a deal was going to happen, it was going to happen in that room. It did not happen. Vance left Islamabad the next day saying the negotiations had not led to an agreement. The talks had lasted 1 day. 1 day of actual negotiation, after 6 weeks of war and 5 years of accumulated mistrust, was not enough to bridge the gap between what Iran thought it had agreed to and what America was actually asking for. The nuclear question was the wall. America wanted a formal commitment from Iran to halt its nuclear enrichment program for at least 10 to 12 years, and to hand over its existing stockpile of approximately 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium before any significant sanctions relief was provided. Iran's position was that the nuclear question should be addressed in a later phase, after the war was declared over, after sanctions were lifted, after the naval blockade was ended. Iran wanted the economic pressure removed first. America wanted the nuclear concession first. Both positions had logic. Neither side was willing to move. The uranium question became the most personal and specific flashpoint. Trump, speaking from the Oval Office, told reporters that during the negotiations leading up to the ceasefire, Iran had verbally agreed to hand over its enriched uranium. He quoted the Iranian position directly. "Number one, you're getting it, but you're going to have to come and take it out." Trump said America was ready to do exactly that, send personnel to Iran to retrieve the uranium stockpile. Then, he said, Iran changed its mind. They did not put it in writing, and when the moment came to formalize what had allegedly been verbally agreed, Iran denied it. Iran's foreign ministry has not confirmed that any such verbal agreement was made. The dispute over the uranium, whether it was offered, accepted, and then withdrawn, sits at the center of Trump's frustration with the entire negotiation process. The deterioration that followed the Islamabad failure was rapid. Trump threatened a full naval blockade on Iran. Within days, American warships were positioned to prevent any vessel from entering or leaving Iranian ports. A blockade designed to strangle Iran's economy completely, not just disrupt its oil exports. The ceasefire that had been announced with such hope less than 2 weeks earlier was effectively over in everything but name. And in the Strait of Hormuz itself, the shooting continued. Both sides were firing at each other's vessels. Both sides were claiming the other had violated the ceasefire first. The IMO was counting stranded sailors. Lloyd's List was reporting the strait was functionally closed. Oil was above $100, and the 15% drop in prices that had happened on the day of the ceasefire announcement had been almost entirely reversed. Iran's domestic political situation is a crucial and underreported dimension of why the deal that Iran thought it had did not survive contact with American intentions. The new Supreme Leader Khamenei had not appeared publicly since the war began. His invisibility was interpreted by analysts as a sign that he was consolidating power and managing the extraordinary political pressures of governing a country that had just survived an American military assault. Inside Iran, two competing impulses were fighting for influence over the negotiating position. The pragmatist faction, represented broadly by Foreign Minister Araghchi and the diplomatic establishment, wanted a deal that provided economic relief and ended the military confrontation, even if it required significant concessions. The hardline faction, represented by the Revolutionary Guard and the parliamentary leadership, was deeply resistant to any agreement that required surrendering the nuclear program or the Strait of Hormuz leverage before Iran received tangible economic benefits. Trump himself identified this internal division as one of the main obstacles to a deal. He told aides he was frustrated by what he perceived as division in Iranian leadership that was preventing Tehran from making substantial concessions. CNN reported this directly. Trump had come to believe that the people he was negotiating with did not have the authority to make the commitments he was asking for, that the Revolutionary Guard and the hardline parliamentary faction were effectively vetoing whatever the diplomatic establishment was agreeing to in Pakistani hotel rooms. If that assessment is accurate, it means the ceasefire that Iran declared victory over on April 7th was never fully authorized by all the forces inside Iran that would need to implement it. Iran thought it had a deal, but the parts of Iran that control the missiles and the naval assets in the strait may never have agreed to it. The proposal that Iran submitted in response to America's latest 14-point document is a study in how far apart the two sides remain. Iran called its proposal focused on ending the war rather than just extending a truce. It wanted all issues resolved within 30 days. It called for guarantees against future attacks from the United States and Israel. It called for a withdrawal of American forces from the region. It called for the release of frozen Iranian assets worth billions of dollars. It called for the lifting of all sanctions. It called for war reparations. And it called for a new mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz, which, in the language of Iran's earlier proposals, means formal international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the waterway. Iranian lawmakers described the American proposal as more of an American wish list than a reality. Trump described the Iranian proposal as totally unacceptable and stupid. He called Iran's leadership lunatics. The administration announced a $15 million reward for information leading to the disruption of the financial networks of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. These are not the words and actions of two governments on the verge of an agreement. And yet, and this is the detail that keeps this conflict from collapsing into pure military confrontation, neither side has announced the end of the ceasefire. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed as recently as May 8th that Iran is still reviewing the latest American proposal. Al Jazeera's correspondent in Tehran reported that diplomatic and mediation efforts are still underway, and that both sides are still interested in diplomatically engaging with each other. The ceasefire is, in Trump's words, on massive life support, but it is not officially dead. The shooting in the strait continues. The proposals continue to move through Pakistani intermediaries. The gap between what Iran thought it had and what America actually intended is real and documented and enormous. And somewhere in that gap, the possibility of a deal still exists, barely, conditionally, sustained by the shared knowledge that the alternative is worse. The Trump administration's plan, to the extent that a coherent plan can be identified beneath the posts and the threats and the paused operations, appears to be maximum economic and military pressure applied simultaneously with diplomatic engagement, in the hope that Iran eventually reaches a pain threshold where accepting American terms becomes less costly than continuing to resist them. The naval blockade, the $15 million IRGC bounty, the threat of resumed major combat operations, these are all tools of that pressure strategy. And the pressure is real. Iran's economy is severely damaged. Its military capability has been significantly degraded. Its energy infrastructure is under threat from its own domestic energy crisis, as well as American pressure. The question is not whether Iran is feeling the pressure. The question is whether the pain of accepting American terms on the nuclear program in public, in a deal that its hardline factions will describe as surrender, is greater or smaller than the pain of continued confrontation. Iran thought it had a deal on April 7th. What it actually had was a ceasefire built on ambiguity, announced by a Pakistani mediator, confirmed by governments that had agreed on different things. Trump had other plans, specifically plans that required Iran to make formal, documented, upfront commitments on its nuclear program before receiving the economic relief it desperately needs. Those plans were not hidden. They were consistent with everything Trump had said publicly about his objectives in this conflict. But in the pressure of the moment, in the urgency of finding a formula that would let oil prices fall and gas prices come down, the gap between Iran's reading of the deal and America's reading of the deal was papered over rather than resolved. When that paper tore, in the talks in Islamabad, in the Oval Office conversation about the uranium, in the missiles fired in the strait, what was underneath was not a deal at all. It was the same fundamental disagreement that has existed between America and Iran for the entirety of this conflict, expressed now in a language of live fire and rejected proposals and a ceasefire that is holding in name only. The strait is still closed. The ceasefire is on life support. Iran is reviewing a proposal it has called unacceptable. Trump is considering resuming major combat operations. Pakistan is still carrying messages between two governments that cannot agree on what they already agreed to. Oil is at $100 a barrel. And the deal that Iran thought it had, the deal that was announced to the world with such hope on April 7th that sent oil prices tumbling, that generated headlines about the beginning of the end, turned out to be a misunderstanding dressed up as diplomacy. Iran thought they had a deal. Trump had other plans. And the 20,000 sailors stranded in the Gulf, and the families paying $4.50 at the gas pump, and the government's rationing energy are all living inside the consequences of that gap.